Ghosts are real. This much I know.
If there's anybody here, please touch my hand. Welcome back to Mom's Making History. Like a moth to the flame, I'm always drawn to the costumes. See what I did there? A good costumer doesn't just aim for historical accuracy, but views how the costumes blend with the story and aesthetic. I would be terrible at reading a teleprompter. I want to take a deep dive into the costumes of Crimson Peak. Written and directed by Guillermo del Toro in 2015, costumes by Kate Hawley. I'm getting Nancy Drew up in this. Major spoilers ahead. For anyone who has not seen the movie, I'm going to discuss the whole thing. Kate Hawley used mostly art pieces and paintings to inspire her work. Instead of creating specific designs off the bat, she created mood boards and color palettes for each character and added these portraits in. One of them is the infamous bridesmaid portrait painted by John Everett Millay. This film can be split nicely into two acts. Act 1 begins in Buffalo, New York. We meet our heroine as she tells the story. Young Edith begins with a halo framing her face from the bonnet she is wearing. It sets up the innocence of her character very, very nicely. And by stark contrast, her mother visits her that night in a full black mourning veil and black mourning gown. Her mourning gown has moths embedded into the skirt, and it's kind of like a warning of what she is proclaiming. As we see later, the moth versus butterfly aesthetic. All of the ghosts in the film were made using practical effects. And while I don't feel qualified to comment on like VFX makeup, her mother's gown sets the scene for both the aesthetic and the time period. Kate Hawley, the costume designer, used the time period as more of an inspiration and then moved from historical accuracy into aesthetic and representation for the ghost and the mood she wanted to set. So the tulle skirt, not as common in the era, but works nicely with the aesthetic of the ghostly aspect, and then you can see all the moths kind of filtered underneath that tulle skirt. This is also the first of many nightgowns. Nightgown count? Though the setting is 1901, we see Edith, played by Mia, oh man, I should probably look up how to say her name. Wasikowska. Thank you, internet. Though the setting is 1901, we see Edith, played by Mia Wasikowska, charging through the street in a garment reminiscent more of 1896. It's the sleeves, and these sleeves make the outfit. Edwardian sleeves begin to lose their volume. Hawley chose the silhouette of a slightly earlier time to achieve a certain aesthetic, and I love her choices because Edith's sleeves make her costumes. They are a huge focal point and work really nicely. Edith already stands out as more masculine among the girls just by her clothing. Her hat is more modest and her coat resembles more of a suit coat. It's very fitting as she laments that even her feminine handwriting gives her away.
I realize now that my handwriting is too feminine. It gives me away.
We meet her father, Bobby Singer. Insert something about Idget here.
Idget.
AKA Mr. Cushing, played by Jim Beaver. Even Mr. Cushing's suits are more warm brown tones. New York is consistently portrayed in a warm light with warm tones to its clothing, and the group pan shot. The background is quite as important to get the silhouette right and They really did that in this film. All of the background characters look in the time period. Edith's second costume comes with her infamous hands belt. Inspired by a pair of historical earrings and meant to be reminiscent of Victorian mourning jewelry, the belt band was woven with human hair. Historical interlude. For those who may not be aware, mourning jewelry has been around for centuries. According to Antique Trader, after the death of her husband Prince Albert in 1861, Queen Victoria helped codify the nuances of grief fashion and maintained her legendary identity as the perpetual widow. She famously and publicly expressed her sorrow over the next 4 decades by shrouding herself in black crepe and lots of jewels, commissioning countless pieces to remember her dearly departed husband and other loved ones. The hands represent her mother holding her tight from beyond the grave, and the symbolism, which is not subtle, but appropriate, as this is when she meets Thomas Sharp for the first time, played by Tom Hiddleston. Ooh, I have something more dramatic for that. Okay! Played by Tom Hiddleston. I'm so funny. When we meet him, his suit is weathered. Building new costumes to look old is a talent in and of itself. The theater I used to work for actually hired a separate person to come in just to distress the clothing that we made. I can't remember the exact title of her job, but it was something like distresser. The costumers who worked on this film did a fantastic job at making this probably freshly built suit look old, weathered, have creases, faded spots. A+. Edith too points out the quality of his suit and what it tells about his character.
Did you see his suit? It was beautifully tailored, but at least a decade old.
I can see that you observe far more than I did.
Thomas's suit is also dated, especially compared to all the warm tones surrounding him in New York. The men here are not lacking in taste. Each has some kind of adornment, whether it be glasses, pocket watches, chains, and it adds so much more to the costume. Nightgown count. What are you doing? Don't eat my pillow. Get down. When Edith attends the party with Thomas, her dress is so aesthetically different from everyone else. And not just from everyone else, but her own style that we've already seen. It's very simple, sleek, not poofy, not frilly. And this is an instance where almost every other woman at this ball has some kind of ruffled adornment, is poofy, is a little bit more of the late Victorian time period, and Edith in this instance is wearing something that is more Edwardian. Edith Cushing, she is not like other girls. Is she the manic pixie dream girl of the early 20th century? Asking the important questions. The biggest dissonance to Edith entering the ball is actually Lucille. It's the first time we see her, and she is wearing what is called the drop of blood dress. Every dress in this film has its own kind of nickname. Lucille is Thomas's sister, played by Jessica Chastain. She's amazing. This dress is the only real warmth she wears in the film. The lacing up the back meant to mimic a spine. It's so interesting. Her train becomes a pool of blood spilling out on the floor around her. You could also say, it's a red flag. There are some historical examples of this kind of backlacing as well, so her dress not only represents that spine, but is historically accurate. Just like her brother, Lucille's silhouette is also dated. Her dress mimics more of an 1880s silhouette rather than the late 90s, early 1900s that we've been seeing in the film so far. If there are any men out there wondering what the female gaze is, this is it. I love a good plaid, and while Private Detective Holly is not on screen for very much time, His aesthetic is on point. Edith again dons her golden suit dress to visit her friend Alan, played by Charlie Hunnam. I'm disappointed that this discussion about spirit photography was not foreshadowing. I feel like it's something they could have circled back on so well later in the film, but it's never brought up again. You know, it establishes that she and her friend Alan have something in common because they both like ghosty things, but then it's never brought up again. Why? Why you leave us hanging like that? Historical interlude number 2. Another thing which was also popularized during Victoria's reign was spirit photography and the age of spiritualism. Some photographers learned that through double exposure, they could create a softened image of a person behind the subject they were taking. Many of these photographers capitalized on the grief of their patrons. One such photographer was William Mumler, who created an image of the deceased Abraham Lincoln standing behind his still alive wife. Some of these photographers were eventually brought up on fraud charges, but who knows? Maybe some were telling the truth. Lucille and her brother stand out dramatically against the warm tones of their New York surroundings. Lucille's only color is the red carnation that she is wearing over her heart. Not subtle symbolism. While she and Edith have a very disturbing discussion about moths versus butterflies. Edith and Lucille are stark opposites, especially when they are at the dining table later that night. Thomas dons his puff tie, which is very different from the other men in the room who are all wearing much more modern to the time ties. Poor Jim Beaver can't catch a break.
Weeping in my Haagen-Dazs, idiot.
I love this little detail of Edith still wearing her dress from the night before because she is just too distraught to change. Now comes the first tonal shift that we see in the morgue. It's more dark. It's got more of like the grays and the blues in the background. It's not as warm. And this tonal shift grows in the film from here on out. This is essentially the finale to Act 1. Act 2, we arrive at Allerdale Hall. Hold on a minute. There we go, darling. Oh, these sleeves. Edith arrives at Allerdale Hall after wedding Thomas Sharp. Something mysterious is going on with him, though. Oh, gasp. Edith still carries the warmth in her gold dress. As she arrives to the hall, she has this jacket with these beautiful, handmade by the costumers, flowers. The violets that adorn her jacket and her hat are actually a symbol of mourning in the era. And a red sash that is tied to her jacket. Thomas, however, in his blue suit, mirrors Lucille, who shows up in her blue house dress, which we see her in a lot in the second act. Again, Lucille's dress is dated closer to the 1880s. The leaves and the acorns adorning her gown meant to reflect the decay of the house. She's becoming part of the house surrounding her. All of the leaves were made by hand using a single string of cording. And I'm not sure if this was intentional, but the acorns to me kind of look like beetles crawling on her. And it gives it that perfect creepy aesthetic. But again, I don't know if that was the intention. The fringe robe, so impractical, so fringy. I want it.
This will make you feel better. What is it? Firethorn berries.
Nightgown count? She wears this nightgown very often, but we're gonna count each scene separately for fun. The sheerness of this nightgown clings to her frame, giving her this like skeletal effect that I love. I think it really represents what is going on in the house after she moves there. She's become a chrysalis, as Holly describes, kind of the butterfly dying and becoming a husk. With another nightgown comes another robe. This robe takes the award for the most outlandish sleeves in the whole film. It really adds to her butterfly wing effect. Edith, looking like those poofs, may start flapping at any minute and carry her away. Her next yellow dress is fondly known as the Nancy Drew. Nancy Drew? The next dress is fondly known as her Nancy Drew dress. Edith Cushing and the Mystery of Allerdale Hall. The darkness of the house has started to creep up into her costume through the black ribbon across her back, but the embroidered flowers still grow upon her sleeves. This gown also embodies her canary in a gold mine inspiration that both Kate Hawley and Guillermo del Toro compared her to. Nightgown scene? Kate Hawley has not outright stated how many nightgowns were made for this film that I could find, but they needed multiples of everything, so it was a lot. I find it interesting that once Edith learns of Allerdale Hall's nickname, Crimson Peak, she is wearing a green velvet jacket. She is kind of half dissolved into this location, her top half being cool and green, her bottom half still being that gold skirt that she wears quite often.
That's when you'll find out why they call this Crimson Peak.
What did you say?
Nightgown scene.
If you're here with me, give me a signal. The Triad.
Ghost Hunting 101 by Edith Cushing. When Edith and Thomas arrive at the depot, Edith is wearing the same jacket she was when she arrived at Allerdale Hall. But there's been some changes to it. The flowers are gone as if they've died off, and her ribbon, which was once red, is now navy. The cream flowers that remain on her hat look as if they are slowly dying. Staying at the depot, we see some of Edith's undergarments, her lace chemise, her skirt, and multiple petticoats, which are all kind of like pink and gold and warm, and I just love the colors. It's so different from the aesthetic of the house that we've been seeing. And then things get a little saucy. I wish we could have an example of the corsets they were wearing. I found an image of Jessica Chastain in a blue faded corset that goes with her costume, but I'm guessing it's from a deleted scene because it's never seen in the film. We love close attention to undergarments. What can I say? Edith once again wears her Nancy Drew dress to snoop around the house, unfortunately tipping off Lucille in the process. They stand once again in that stark opposition, the gold versus the blue.
You'll feel better soon.
Nightgown scene, and she'll remain in this nightgown for the remainder of the film. And then we get the big reveal, the big twist. Lucille's nightgown. Nightgown count. Lucille wraps a blue-gray robe kind of over her dramatic nightgown and ties it with a red ribbon. Now, I don't have any evidence other than my eyes, but I speculate that the ribbon is the same one that Edith wore with her jacket at the beginning of her arrival to Allerdale Hall. Lucille, however, carries no warmth with this costume. The red on her person becoming more of like a bloodlust rather than the warmth that Edith carries with her warm tone clothing. The Sharp siblings are now free of the lie. Thomas has discarded his tie, and Lucille has discarded her entire dress. Her entire mask is off. She is out and proud of who she is. A serial killer. I love the nod to hair again as memorial. Of course, in this case, it's Lucille collecting it as a trophy and adding it to her 4 other strands. So maybe it's a little bit on the creepy side. Mom's Making History, brought to you by Grave Jewelers. Need to keep a piece of that loved one around? Contact Grave Jewelers today. This is not a real advertisement. And they make a good cat toy. Edith's pen finally comes in handy. Crimson Peak has earned its name. The blood soaking through all of the white garments is a direct reflection of the clay seeping through the snow outside. Lucille moves through the house like a ghost, a prime example of how the costumes truly add to the aesthetic of this film. The aesthetic is romantic, even in this context. We see Thomas one final time, his ghost pale white, unlike the red clay ghosts that we've seen so far. All of these were practical effects and makeup used for this as well. Edith prevails the loss of the innocents. The final scene, Lucille's ghost sits at the piano. Her ghost is dark and decayed, wearing the same blue dress she always wore in Allerdale Hall. I didn't like this film the first time I saw it, because I went into it thinking that it was just a horror movie, a ghost movie, but it's not. It is actually mostly a gothic romance with ghosts in it. The ghost is a metaphor. It took a couple viewings for me to really enjoy it once I knew what it was, but it has become my favorite costumed film. Every costume has a voice. Every costume in this film has a personality and adds to the personality of the person wearing it. It really is a joy to watch as a costume design perspective. Thank you for joining us at Mom's Making History. It's been a while. I'm hoping to get back to filming more, and I have a lot of ideas and things I want to make now that I have a little teeny tiny bit of free time while all of my kids are in school, which is only a couple days a week. Thank you for joining us here at Mom's Making History, and hope to see you again soon. Bye! There's a ghost in my photo.